So here we have this moment in time now where Jesus is with his disciples. And they're in this place called the Upper Room. And as I told 9 o'clock, I apologize because I know over the last 2 years I have bragged about going to Israel. And I know that I will probably continue to talk about how I've gone to Israel. Well, one of the most amazing places when we were there is as we were walking, our tour guide, because he's lived there his entire life, gone to the universities, he's been near where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. He himself has had discoveries. He is so unmoved by any of this. Well, I remember as we were walking with our group, we're going to this place, and he said, we're about to go into the Upper Room. And he just said it like it was no big deal, like as if it was his own bedroom he was taking us to. It was just like no big deal, and he's like, we're going here. And then we just kind of stopped, and we said, well, are you saying this is the upper room where the Last Supper and things of this nature were taking place? Like this is the room where it said the 120 went before the day of Pentecost and received the Spirit? And he just kind of, again, was like, yeah. And we're like, okay, I know you're not a religious person, you're not a Christian, but you need to give us a moment here as these Americans who are pastors for the most part, almost all of us, that we're about to enter this. And so as we go in there, we kind of go through this door, a little bit smaller, so it was perfect for me. I didn't have to duck whatsoever. So we walk in there, and as we're walking in this upper room, I could just feel this overwhelming sense of this is where a lot of things have taken place. This is where the Spirit came upon the disciples, and when the earthquake shook and they felt it in the room and the Holy Spirit just took over. And this is the same place where Jesus in that moment did this. We could only imagine what the disciples were going through. Just think about it. Here we are. Just imagine the scene up here. There's a table. For the most part in that time, there wasn't a lot of chairs. So they would be leaning down, sitting kind of shoulder to shoulder, and they would kind of be up against one another. Just imagine as you're eating there, this whole last few days, started with Palm Sunday, you're a few days in, and Jesus is now having more serious conversations with you. And you're slowly picking up that he might die. But you're not 100% sure just yet. And all of a sudden, he gets up from the table. He starts to remove this outer piece. He takes on a towel. He starts to get a water basin. And all of a sudden, sometimes it's like the movies we watch, where all of a sudden it's like a freeze frame. And then they kind of just focus on one thing. It was just like that. The disciples, here they are eating, probably mid putting something in their mouth. And all of a sudden, like, what is going on over here? What is Jesus doing? And as he's disrobing, as he's taking upon a towel, as he's getting this water basin, he begins to grab a foot, which I'm sure for some of us would be no-no. Some of us are like, I don't like people touching my feet. I don't like even people looking at my feet. And here we have Jesus taking the foot of Peter, and he takes it, and as he's pouring it, I could only imagine the weight in that room of what is he doing? And we see Peter immediately saying, Lord, you should not be doing this. Are you washing my feet? And he said, you don't know what I'm doing just yet. Lord, you will never wash my feet. And he's saying, Peter, you'll understand one day. Just let me do this. And then Peter, being the human that he is, and maybe we'll even ascribe it to being the man that he is, then says, well, while you're at it, why don't you wash me from my head to my toe? To which Jesus says, Peter, you're clean. Again, this wasn't a knock to Jesus. This wasn't any type of thing that Peter was saying disrespectfully. See, this is the culture of the time where they were used to ceremonial cleansing. So even for a priest, before they did certain duties, they would dip themselves almost like a baptism, go underwater 7 different times. And they would come up head to toe, cleansing their entire selves before they did something. So right here, this is the reference Peter is making. He's like, well, Lord, don't just wash my feet. I need to cleanse my entire person. My entire body ceremonially needs to be cleaned. So as we see Jesus already showing here that it's not about the ritual and the tradition, but instead he's looking at the heart and saying, Peter, you don't know it yet, son, but you are clean. So let me just serve you right now, because you are clean. Now, as we have this moment in time, there's a few things we could absolutely take from it today, and I hope and pray that it would transform us, and at least speak to us. So the very first thing on the inside of the bulletin, if you're taking notes, number one is Jesus led with a cross and a towel. Jesus led with a cross and a towel. If we think about it, he could have easily have led with a kingdom. He could have led with a sword. He could have led with an army. He could have done so many things, but yet he chose to lead with a cross and a towel. Here he is doing something very unexpected. Last week we talked about Palm Sunday as he came down riding on all things a donkey to fulfill a prophecy. He didn't come on in a horse, this muscular horse with armor and that you would imagine for a king to be riding on. And so very unexpectedly he comes in. And yet now here we see him doing the very same thing, being very unexpected. Why? Because in the culture of that day, here we have Rome. We have people like gladiators. Think about when people were fed to lions and bears. Like that was a real reality. How brutal it was then. How they would have fights to death. How they would have armies come up against one another. How they would completely indulge the sinfulness and the things of the flesh. Passion, desire. At times we feel that our world today is corrupt and so bad, and absolutely there are parts and portions of it. But if we look at even the world in the Roman days, it was horrible. Talk about sin. It was all over the place, in your face. And at that point in time, they did not even have the gospel yet. The church wasn't even on the scene. So here we have the church now where at least we're doing something to combat darkness, and we have the light of the world, Jesus, and ourselves. But in this time, they didn't even have the church. They didn't even have the gospel. And what we saw was basically if it felt good, you do it. You consume it. And if you were a leader, an army officer, general, absolutely you would not serve the people that are under you. There was no way you would take off your helmet to then take off the sandal of one of your foot soldiers. You didn't do that. And yet we see Jesus in a very unexpected way displaying what people might call weakness, but in great strength. Here we see the Messiah in all power and glory displaying his leadership through service. Not only was Jesus leading through power and authority, but we see him leading through humility and grace. Man, I would say those are two words today that our leadership needs. And when I say leadership, I just mean in general, in churches, in our homes, in our marriages, with children, in our schools, in our government, you name it. Today, more than ever, we need humility and grace. Rather than people who are trying to lead through power and authority. Because people who have power and authority, what we see is from the Lord, is that is simply given to them because the Lord has allowed for them to have that power and authority. So they're assuming something that's not even theirs in the first place. What we see is when somebody leads with humility and grace, what we see is people will gladly submit and give that power and authority. And that's what we see in Jesus. In no way was he demanding it. In no way was he forceful with Peter. Peter, give me that foot. Let me clean your feet. In no way, rather, we see this very moment of just saying, you know what, Peter, son, you don't know what I'm doing, but I'm showing you a way in which that you should live. And I'm living in such a way that I've always lived this way with you guys. And I want you now to lead your life with humility and with grace. Again, I can think about the disciples. I can imagine what they were thinking. That moment, and Peter was like, Lord, are you really washing my feet right now? To which the Lord's like, yes, I am. What we see is the cross and the towel. They each represent another set of words. So if you're taking notes, you can write the word cross and put an equal sign and put sacrifice. Cross equals sacrifice. Now, many of us know what sacrifice is. We know what it's like to sacrifice. Here's this definition. It's an act of giving up something valued for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. Now, something that maybe some have also grown up with. I learned this image of sacrifice through my mother. Now, one thing when I was growing up, didn't see a whole lot. When you're a child, you're observant of some things, but you're not observant of everything. let's just be honest. At times when we were young kids, we were kind of what we call la la land. You're in the moment certain times, and other times you're just kind of like, butterfly. You're just kind of, so distracted. As a child, there were so many things that would go on. I didn't learn until I was older, where my mom began to tell us the stories of, there were a handful of times there, if not a lot, where I went without so you and your sister could have food. Which at the time, growing up, you're just thinking, Mom doesn't like to eat. When you're growing up, I was just like, well, maybe Mom is just too busy. She can't eat, which is probably true. But I remember just thinking, I'm like, why doesn't Mom eat as much as us? Or why is Mom not eating? And I remember she said, there's those moments when your dad, when he was in jail, or when your dad was doing this and doing that, there was moments and times where I had to think, okay, am I eating or are they eating? And to see just the humility and grace that my mom handled that with, that I never knew that until I became older. See, she knew sacrifice. I have known sacrifice. Many of us here have known sacrifice. And to think about with Jesus, let's just think about the cross equals sacrifice. So let's just put ourselves in this. The act of giving up something valued for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. So here we have the Savior of the world, King of kings, Lord of lords, saying, I value my own life, but I will sacrifice it for something of greater worth and value to me. And he's speaking about us. To me, as I said that in the earlier service, and I say it now, if that doesn't do something for us, something's wrong. Because to think about that the Savior of the world, King of kings, says, I value my life. I'm the creator of the universe. And yet I will sacrifice it for something that I consider to have greater worth. That he would look to us and say, now there is someone that I'm willing to sacrifice my life for. What we see is that true leadership sacrifices self and elevates others before self. That's what leaders do. That's what we do as leaders in our home, in our marriages, in our workplaces, wherever the Lord might call us. We're called to be people who, once again, elevate others before self, because leadership has a sense and an element of sacrifice. And that's what the cross is. Now you can write tau and put equals service. Tau equals service. This is the action of helping or doing work for someone. So I know for many of us, we know what this is. We know what this is like. We've served people, or we've had other people serve us. Many of us have had many times where we've gone on mission trips potentially, where we've done things even locally in the city, or we've served someone in the church body, or we've served a neighbor, or we've had people serve us. We had a huge blessing yesterday, as I mentioned about us moving, and many of you have been praying for us. We had about a good 20, 25 people from the church yesterday who came by with trucks and trailers and you name it, and they all pulled up, and we were able to get everything in just one trip over and then unloaded, and it was just amazing. And I think I probably about 6-7 different times just kept saying, I said, there was no words, I said, but let me just say thank you for us. And yesterday, many of them, and even today, just said, it was such our pleasure to be able to serve you. And for me, that was such a blessing to be able to receive that, at the same time to know when I do it, how much of a blessing it is. It is such a blessing to be able to serve. When simply put, though, the gospel motivates us to serve because Christ served and continues to serve us. See, sometimes that's the hard part about serving, is when someone's ungrateful. That's the hard part. Or it's somebody that you don't really know. For me, I can only equate it to family, as many of my stories and applications of the Bible are, because I have a large family, so some of this makes sense to me in that way. My uncles were always awesome to me. My aunts, on the other hand, as I've shared stories about them here, it's been hit and miss. And so there were so many times where you have an aunt that wants you to run an errand, or can you pick up your cousin, or can you do this, can you do that? And generally there's one you're always okay with. You're like, you could even ask me to drive 5 hours, and yes. And then there's always this other few that you're like, I don't know about this one. You're like, I just don't know. Because you start to measure, okay, what have they done, what have they not done? But yet here what we see is we serve not based on what others have done, but what Christ has done for us. See, that's the mindset we have when we serve someone, when we serve others, is to simply not serve with the attitude of, what am I getting out of this? What am I getting back? Or to say, I'm going to serve because when the time comes, then I'm going to be the one to put it on them. That's not our motivation. Our motivation and our mindset whenever we serve is to simply say, what has Christ done for me? And just simply let that be the launch pad. To say, he has done so much for me that all I do is I sacrifice my time, energy, things I might do just to serve others. When we think about Jesus in that moment could have easily said what? He could have said, hey, okay, Peter, now it's your turn. You wash my feet. And Jesus could have easily threw his feet up there on the table and said, it's my turn. All of you now come wash my feet. And yet, what did we see Jesus say? He said, I'm setting you an example to do this to one another. Even in that moment where Jesus could have demanded authority and power, he could have demanded them to do something, he then said, do this to one another. So we see in his humility and in his grace, he was serving them not to get it back in return, not for a sense of reward, but rather he was simply serving them out of a motivation to serve. And here we now, as disciples of Jesus, what we have is this sense now we can do the same. Now what we can do is we can serve anybody, any person, any wrong they might have done against us. Doesn't matter. We can simply put the mindset here. What has Christ done for me? Open our eyes and then serve. We are called to lead our lives by a cross and a towel. The second thing we see is this. Number 2 is that a way of a disciple is being a servant. The way of a disciple is being a servant. Now, for some of us, we might not like this point, and we might want to already get up and walk out because we're like, yeah, to be a disciple is to be a servant. I thought being a disciple was just being a disciple. I thought being a disciple meant I could just stay exactly how I am and how I was. Yet what we see here is that the way of a disciple is being a servant. Jesus tells his disciples, he said, if I then, here he goes, he establishes right here his power and authority. He brings it back. He says, if I then, your Lord and teacher. He sets them up. He's showing them to display humility and grace. He's establishing himself with the cross and the towel. He's telling them to do this unto others. And then in this moment, he brings it back and he says this. The only reason he takes back the power and authority in that moment is to say this. If I then, your Lord and teacher, as he takes back the power and authority, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. So in this moment, again, rather than throwing his feet up, rather than telling them, okay, do this for me now, he takes back the power and authority so that all he might say, if I, Lord and teacher, King of kings, Lord of lords, if I can do this, you can do this. As a matter of fact, I'm calling and asking you to do this. Because the way of a disciple is being a servant. The instruction here is very simple. Jesus is saying this, if you want to be his disciple, get ready to serve. That's what he's saying. Just very plain and clear. It doesn't get any simpler than that. He's saying, if you want to be my disciple, get ready to serve. So what does that mean? That means you're going to get dirty. When we serve, we get dirty. That means we're going to be tired. That means there's going to be those moments where we cannot wait to go to sleep because it has been such a long day of serving. That's what this means. If we want to be a disciple of Jesus, we better get ready to serve. Why? Because the way of a disciple is being a servant. Why? Because Jesus said, King of kings, Lord of lords, I came to serve, not to be served. See, that's a hard thing because in this life, we're programmed from day one to be served, every single one of us. And at times, especially, and I love all the ladies in the house, but especially as ladies. Why? Because we're told, you're a princess. Just like in my household, I tell my girls, you're a princess. And what do we tell princesses? Princesses get taken care of their whole life. The kingdom is theirs. And the king listens to the queen, right? And whatever the princess wants, the princess gets. And that's the mentality. Think about it. At a very young age, we give our young children. And that's naturally where they are. And they remain there unless they grow up and mature out of it. as our very default nature is to be served. In my household, and maybe it's been in yours, and maybe you've seen this happen. In my household, I have my daughters who, here we are yesterday moving into our house, and we're doing all of these things that to them are totally oblivious to. What are they doing? Watching a movie. And here I am hanging off a roof, and I'm doing this and doing that. I'm upside down. I'm doing all of these things. And what does my youngest daughter come in as if nothing's going on? Dad, I want some water. And in my mind, the first thing I'm thinking is the cups are over there. The refrigerator is the same kind of refrigerator we had over here, and it works exactly the same. Just you're thinking in your mind, do you not see what I'm doing? It looks like Daddy jumped in the ocean right now because I'm sweating. How do you not see this? But here's the truth. That's our default nature. Even as grown men and women, that's our default nature, is to be served. As we look at this world and we say, well, everybody needs to serve me. Well, serve me here, serve me there. Well, when I was growing up, I was always served. I never did this for somebody. It was always done for me. And we might have this reality in our mind that it all revolves around us, that when we walk through these church doors, it revolves around us. That when we go home, it revolves around us. That when we go to our workplaces, when we go to the grocery store, that it revolves around us and everybody else is supposed to be serving us. That's our default nature if we let it sit. But yet here, Jesus is radically coming against this, almost in a very physical way, and saying, no. You are to be a servant because I, Jesus, lead with a cross and a towel, and there's a sacrifice that comes with it. There's a great deal of service that comes with it. And if I then, your Lord and teacher, do this, you ought to as well. Wayne Cordero is a pastor out in Hawaii, and they have a ton of churches all around Hawaii, lots of campus churches that they do. They meet in high schools. I believe even the main campus. They're well into the 50,000 just kind of worldwide. And I believe they still meet in a high school after 30 years. What they do is rather than having a mortgage, rather than having buildings in debt, what they do is they donate a huge portion of their income to the schools. So the schools they meet in, they buy them all of their sound equipment. They buy them their projectors. If the school needs new chairs, they buy the new chairs. Whatever it is, they because they don't have buildings, they invest it back into the community. And as a quick side note, too, we need to be praying for him. I know just recently he was diagnosed with cancer, a very strong form. But his name was Wayne Cordero. And he wrote a book called Doing Church as a Team. And this is one of the lines that's in that book. And this is something I read as a 19-year-old on staff at a church that had a relationship with this man in his church. And to this day, this statement still has sat with me. And he wrote this in the book. The fastest way to the throne is through service. The fastest way to the throne is through service. And that has forever stuck with me from that moment in time. As I read that, as I underlined it, as I highlighted that has forever stuck right here in my mind. That if we ever want to grow in our depth and maturity as a Christian, as a disciple, if we're in a space where we're just like, you know what, I'm a little bit stagnant, this isn't the only way. This isn't a do this and it's going to immediately, instantly, like miracle grow happen. But one of the ways that we get to the throne quicker is through service. For us to look more like Christ is to serve. And to serve with the mindset and the attitude that I'm doing this not because of what you've done, not because of anything I'm getting in return, not because of a reward that I'm seeking, but I'm simply doing this because what Christ has done for me in the sense of the gospel. What we see is that the fastest way to get there is through service. If we should ever outdo one another in anything, a good place to start would be serving. If we should ever try to outdo those of us right now sitting next to each other or anybody else in the early service or anybody else who's in our church membership, if there's ever anything we should try to outdo one another in, one of those would be serving. Could we imagine if all of us just walked through here and just all was on our mind was just to serve somebody? But instead, think about it. When we come, what is it about? It's a little bit about a self-service, right? We come in, we're like, man, I hope Ricky's good today because he wasn't last week. And so I'm really hoping and praying he's good because I need a good word, right? Who needs that? I need a good word. I need to get there on time so I can get my seat. I got to get there in time because the donuts get taken away at a certain time. So I need the donuts and coffee. And it's this whole sense of service and thinking about, okay, what can I get from this? Again, serving me. Everything here is established and built to serve you. And what if instead we came through these doors and if our mindset was, Lord, show me one person to serve today before I leave. Lord, direct me to one person here as I walk in this sanctuary, as I walk the halls. Lord, direct me to one person. And show me how I can serve them. Could you imagine? Already our line is long getting out of here because I stand at the back. Could you imagine, though, if we were all out there just trying to outdo one another, opening the door for each other? You could go first. No, you could go first. No, I just want to serve you this day. You could go. We would be here all day long, and we would be having the fire marshal coming in here telling us, hey, you guys need to get out of here. This is a fire hazard. Let's go. But could you just imagine, the nominating committee at a point like 2 weeks into the job saying, we're done? Could you imagine that nominating committee would just be so excited just to say, we finished it in 2 weeks. It didn't take 14 months. And I realize there's only 12 months in a year. It didn't take us 14, 15 months. It took us 2 weeks because everybody was just dying to throw their name out there to serve. Has that ever happened in 61 years? I don't think it has. Could you imagine when people would walk through and just say, how can I be a servant to somebody here? How can I be a servant to the church? How can I be a servant? Not because I'm seeking something, not because I want something back, but because simply what Christ has done for me. Could we imagine the fastest way to the throne is through service? As we close, I just have 3 things. They're not on the screen, but you could just write them under down point 2. There are 3 areas that we could grow in our service as a disciple. The very first one, just write down serving God. That's one way, serving God is a way that we've been called to serve as a disciple. Now, this isn't the only way, but I would say a large way to serve God is to submit our bodies as living sacrifices. This is something a few weeks back in Revival, Thurman brought this up as he was preaching Romans 1-2 to saying our lives are to be our spiritual act of worship as presenting them as living sacrifices. One way that we serve God is we simply present ourselves and say, Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll say what you want me to say. I'll pray for who you want me to pray. I'll go where you want me to go. I'll do this. Lord, I just am indebted to you. And to present our very lives as sacrifices and say, Lord, I'm all yours. Whatever you want me to do. Another way is serving the church. So not only serving God, but serving the church. It says we are called as disciples to serve the body of Christ. So we make it our aim to find ways to serve in the ministry and to serve one another. Again, as I mentioned in early service was at times when we come to church and we look at church, all we see is a finished product. That's what we see. When Sunday mornings comes along, we see a finished product. And as we look around, what do we think more often than not? Everything's taken care of. I don't need to do anything. And what happens? Then we get into that mode once again of what? Self-service. Well, hey, looks like everything's happening like it's supposed to, so I'm going to put my hands behind and kick them up on the pews, and I'm just going to take it all in. But here's the truth. If we could be honest and pull back the curtain a little bit, I will let you in on a little secret every pastor shares in. We never have enough volunteers. We are never 100% having it all together. Sometimes things are happening, and it's just happening at the last minute, but you don't know that. Just like what happens when you're performing a wedding. I've done plenty of weddings, and every single bride looks at me, and she tells me this: we are going to start on time. And what do I tell every single bride? I'm sure you will. But let me just tell you, every wedding I've ever done, small or big, have all started 15 minutes late. Minimum 15 minutes late. Every single one of them. But I will let you think that it's going to be happening to you. But let me just tell you, just plan on being 15 minutes from whatever your start time was. And what's happening in the behind scenes that we don't see in the audience when the wedding's going on? You don't see the pastor running over here, the pastor's running over here, and he's got to meet with the grooms. Where is the best man? Where are the rings? And you're just sitting over there, man, it's 5 minutes late already. What's going on? And you look back, and it's calm, everybody's smiling. But what you don't see is over here, the caterer's truck's on fire, and the flower girl is up in the tree getting dirty. You don't see any of that. And in the same sense, in the same way, it's like that with church. Sometimes we come in and we look around and we're like, well, place isn't on fire. I guess we're okay. Things still happening. Ricky's still preaching because we pay him, so he's still here. Things look like it's going along, right? Let me let you in on a little secret. We have a spot for every single person that's sitting here and who's not here. There are ways, not even to serve on a scale of on a stage, but there are ways to serve one another. Let me tell you, there are people this morning, you might be one of them, there was a few in first service that are broken, who came in here, and you might be having a really good day right now, but just give it a week. You might be broken next week. Just give it a few days. And what if you just, when you came through those glass doors, and you just prayed and you said, Lord, direct me to somebody that I can serve. Not for me, not so that Ricky sees me and he can write my name down and he saw me serving, but simply because it's like what Christ has done for me is so overwhelming that the only thing I can do is to serve somebody else. What if we came through these doors and rather than letting the person who has the countenance kind of down, rather than walking by them, what if we stopped right there and prayed? What if we served that person? What if we saw somebody fumbling along out in the parking lot and we kind of looked out there and we're like, you know, that's pretty far to walk. What if instead we said, you know what, Lord? I see someone over there. I'm going to serve them. Do you need help with this? Can I bring this in there? Is there anything I can do? Just to be the person that's walking around saying, is there anything that I can do? Can I help in any way? There are countless things, weekend after weekend after weekend, where we can be serving one another. You might not be up on stage. You might not be doing something very much out in the front public, but there are so many ways to serve people in this church and to serve one another, and Christ has called us to do that. And then lastly, would be serving the world. So we serve God, we serve in the church, and then we serve the world. There was always a measure of our Christian life to have a greater awareness of serving the world for Christ. There was always a measure. Now, I'm going to use a term right now that is probably going to make some of you kind of move a little bit in your pew because it's come to be a really bad word. You don't like this word. And here's the word. The word is global. I know some of them, when we think about like global economy, when we start to talk about global government, we start to think about one world government. We're like, that sounds nice, but I've heard somewhere that's not good. We hear about one world currency. We're like, yeah, that sounds good. But then we read something else, we're like, that's not right though. Something's not right. Well, here's a term though. We are a global church. And we are to be global Christians. So that is a positive way that we can use this phrase. We are a global church. It's not just about us. Believe me, it is not just about Hillcrest. It is not just about Bethlehem down the street or Holland Baptist on Atwood or anybody else in between. It is not just about that. God's kingdom does not revolve around Hillcrest. By no means does it revolve around us. By no means does it revolve around me. what we see is that we are a global church, and we have churches all around the world, and we have Christians all around the world, and pastors and leaders all around the world, missionaries all around the world. We have people right now that you and I don't even know the names of, maybe can't even speak the language of, but they're getting baptized today. People are responding to the gospel today in a language that you and I would look at and say, I don't know what they're saying, but it sounds good. We are a global church. We are global Christians. And we are called to have this sense of how can we serve the world. Part of that obviously is through local and foreign missions. That's doing missions here and missions abroad. That's by doing things like we're doing today about the bread boxes, extending out for global hunger relief. And for some, we might be in a stage where that's what we can do. And for some of us, we might be able to do more. We might be able to go somewhere. And that's the call. I mean, there is missionaries, young and old, that we know of that are on the mission field that they have not stopped one beat, and they're continuing to serve the world. And what we see is that Jesus has called us to serve not only him, not only his church, but to serve the world. And our world can be as small as our family, it can be as large as our neighborhood, it can be large as our workplace, and it can be as large as us going somewhere overseas. What we see is that the way of a disciple is being a servant. Jesus leads by service, and the expectation is we model what we see in him. What I will close with again is just something simple in our life, going back to family, going back to kids. We model what we see being done in the Father. If you're like me, I'm sure most of us in parenting spent enough of our days being terrified of one idea, that our kids might end up like us. Anybody with me like that? Anybody be honest here with me? You had an idea of there might have been certain behaviors or patterns or things in your life that you were just hoping and praying, Lord, please don't let them get this from me. Don't let them pick this up. Until one day what ends up happening? They do it and you're like, there's my mini-me. There they are, right? And then sometimes you catch yourself because you see your parents in you. And so for me right now, that's how it is with our youngest. I love her ridiculously. I love that little girl, and she constantly is bringing smiles to us because of what comes out of that mouth. But there are times where we are hoping and praying, don't let that come out. At a restaurant, at school, at here, you're just kind of like, where did you get that from? And it's never anything that's derogatory or something that we're like a bad word, but it's just these things we're like, just don't say that. And I hope and I pray that I could live in such a way that they would model what they see their father doing. And if anything that I could show my girls is to show them that Dad's a servant. Dad's not Ricky, senior pastor of Hillcrest. Dad's Ricky, lead servant of Hillcrest. Daddy isn't somebody who, just because of a name or a title or position he might have, that he just kind of walks around and lets people serve him just for the sake of letting people serve him. He's not the type of person that is taking advantage of someone saying, you know, Pastor, we just want to bless you. He's not that kind of guy. But rather what they see is they see their dad getting dirty. They see their dad going to bed extremely tired after a full day's work of doing church stuff. And yet still has time to then serve them and to say, you know what, you're not getting sloppy seconds. If anything my girls could see in me, I hope and pray that they see a heart of a servant. And in the same way, it's like that with Christ, is that Jesus led by service, and the expectation is that we would model what we see in him. And I'll tell you this, there is nothing self-serving about Jesus. So if you are seeing self-serving in yourself, you need to repent. Because he said, if I then am Lord and teacher, you ought to do this as well. With that, let me pray.